My mother-in-law claimed my baby wasn't her son's. The DNA test backfired. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. If Helen hadn't slammed that $800 premium genetic testing kit onto my dining table during my daughter's baptism reception, her own husband never would have found out her 30-year secret. The house was completely full of our guests. My infant daughter, Lily, was asleep in her bassinet near the window. Helen stood over the catering spread, staring at me with a look of absolute, rigid disgust. She didn't bother to lower her voice when she spoke. In fact, she made sure the entire living room was dead silent first. "I saw the pediatrician's discharge paperwork on the kitchen counter," Helen announced, pointing a meticulously manicured finger at the documents I'd carelessly left out. "Lily's blood type is O negative. My family does not carry that blood type. Our bloodline is A and AB. It is a biological impossibility for my son to father an O negative child." I sat there on the sofa, holding a half-empty glass of ice water, my face burning as 30 heads turned to stare at me. I looked at Mark. He was standing near the arched doorway, his face pale, holding a small plate of appetizers. He didn't speak. He didn't defend me. He just stared blankly at the floor. "Helen," I said, keeping my voice as steady as humanly possible, "I am O negative. Mark is O negative. Two O negative parents have an O negative baby. That is basic, elementary biology." "Mark is a negative," she snapped back instantly, pulling a folded piece of paper from her expensive purse. "I have his original birth records right here. You are a liar, Sarah. You married my son for his trust fund, and you thought you could pass off some stranger's child as Arthur's granddaughter. I want a full legal DNA and genetic panel done immediately, or I am cutting Mark off and hiring lawyers to ensure you don't get a dime." Arthur, my father-in-law, finally stepped forward. He was a quiet, deeply respected man, and he looked thoroughly devastated. "Helen, please. Not right now in front of everyone." But the damage was already done. The silence in the room was entirely suffocating. I looked at my husband, desperately waiting for him to tell his mother she was insane, to kick her out of our home. Instead, Mark slowly set his plate down and looked at me with a horrible, questioning expression. He actually asked me if there was something I needed to confess. Mark's hesitation broke something deep inside me that I honestly don't think can ever be repaired. To understand why his sudden silence cut so deeply, you have to understand exactly how Helen has treated me since the very day we met. She never bothered to hide her contempt. I was a public school teacher. Mark was the sole heir to Arthur's massive commercial real estate empire. In Helen's highly critical eyes, I was a parasite looking for a payday. 2 years ago, at our rehearsal dinner, she cornered me in the country club restroom. She didn't yell. She just calmly adjusted her diamond earrings in the mirror and whispered, "You are a temporary phase. Mark will eventually realize he needs a partner with pedigree, not a charity case." I told Mark about that conversation on the drive home. He told me I was probably just misunderstanding her fiercely protective nature. He always played Switzerland. He hated conflict, especially with his mother, who ultimately controlled the purse strings of his current tech startup. Now, standing in our living room, the ultimate accusation hung heavy in the air. Helen's bizarre claim that Mark was A negative was completely unhinged. Before I gave birth, Mark and I discussed blood types for the hospital registry. He explicitly told me he was O negative. But now, with Helen wildly waving an old, yellowed document from his childhood, Mark was suddenly second-guessing his own memory in front of everyone. I always thought I was O," Mark stammered weakly, looking nervously between me and his mother. "You are A negative, Mark. Just like your grandfather," Helen declared sharply. "She is trying to confuse you to cover her tracks. The science does not lie." Arthur looked physically ill. He absolutely adored Mark, and he had been overjoyed about Lily's arrival. He gently touched Helen's arm, quietly asking her to lower her voice, but she aggressively shrugged him off. She was visibly reveling in this moment. She had finally found the perfect weapon she needed to destroy my marriage. I realized right then that defending myself verbally was entirely useless. Helen had brought a rigged game to my daughter's baptism. I walked over to the table, picked up the genetic kit box, and looked directly into Helen's cold, triumphant eyes. I refused to let her see me cry. I agreed to take the DNA test on one very specific condition. I demanded that the test be administered at an independent, neutral medical laboratory. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the independent medical clinic made everyone in the room look pale and sickly. I sat in the hard plastic chair, holding Lily tightly to my chest. Mark sat 2 seats away, staring blankly at the beige floor tiles. Helen had fiercely insisted on coming, and she essentially dragged Arthur with her. She claimed it was to ensure I didn't bribe the lab technicians, but I knew the actual reason. She wanted a captive audience for my ultimate humiliation. "We need to be absolutely thorough," Helen told the clinic director, her sharp voice echoing in the quiet waiting room. "I want the standard trio paternity test, but I also want a comprehensive genetic lineage panel. I want Arthur's DNA tested as well, to definitively prove this child has zero genetic link to his paternal line. We are establishing legal precedent for a massive fraud lawsuit." Arthur sighed, looking incredibly exhausted. "Helen, is my swab really necessary? This entire circus is already tearing the family apart." "It is entirely necessary, Arthur," she insisted, patting his arm with a patronizing smile. "We have to protect your legacy. You'll thank me when this ugly business is finally over." The nurse eventually called us back one by one. They carefully swabbed the inside of my cheek. They swabbed Lily, who squirmed and cried at the sudden intrusion. Then they swabbed Mark. Finally, Arthur stepped up to the chair and allowed the technician to swab him as well. Helen watched the entire procedure like a hawk, nodding in deep satisfaction as the plastic vials were sealed with tamper-proof barcodes and securely placed into the outgoing shipping bag. When we walked out into the bright parking lot, Mark finally tried to speak to me. "Sarah, I just want to clear the air. Once this test comes back, my mom will have to formally apologize and we can finally move forward." I didn't even look at him as I carefully strapped Lily into her infant car seat. I felt entirely isolated. My husband was treating this like a minor domestic misunderstanding instead of a nuclear strike on my character. I closed the heavy car door and faced him, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "When this comes back," I said firmly, "I am taking my daughter and I am leaving you." The color completely drained from his face as the reality of the situation finally landed. The clinic portal sent an automated text stating results would take 14 days. The oppressive silence in our house over the next week was absolutely agonizing. Mark slept alone in the guest bedroom. We communicated only about essential logistics, groceries, diaper changes, and taking out the trash. He desperately tried to initiate conversations, offering weak, pathetic justifications for why he didn't shut his mother down immediately at the baptism. He kept nervously repeating that he just wanted absolute, undeniable proof so Helen could never question Lily's parentage again. He genuinely didn't understand that by publicly entertaining her accusation, he had already broken his vows to me. But as the days dragged on, my initial anger began to crystallize into sharp, incredibly focused curiosity. Something about Helen's dramatic performance at the baptism simply didn't make sense. I kept replaying her absolute, unwavering certainty. She hadn't just accused me. She had brought a tangible prop. That yellowed pediatric document she waved around the room. I am a meticulously organized person. When Mark and I were updating our life insurance policies last year, I handled all the complex medical history forms. I distinctly remembered seeing Mark's college blood donor card explicitly listing him as O-negative. So how could Helen possibly possess a childhood medical document stating he was A-negative? Was it a deliberate forgery? A clerical error she weaponized? I needed to see that specific document. I needed to understand exactly what lie Helen was using to maliciously manipulate my husband. If I was going to divorce Mark and fight Helen's expensive corporate lawyers for custody, I needed to completely dismantle her evidence piece by piece. On Thursday afternoon, Mark went to the office for a mandatory board meeting. I knew Helen was attending an exclusive charity luncheon in the city, a high society event she had aggressively bragged about for months. Arthur was out of town surveying a commercial property in Chicago. Their massive, pristine estate in the suburbs would be completely empty, save for the housekeeper who knew me well and always assumed I had open permission to be there. I packed Lily into her stroller and drove directly to my in-laws' house. I politely told the housekeeper I needed to grab some old tax documents Mark had left in his childhood bedroom. She smiled warmly and let me in without a second thought. I walked straight past Mark's room and headed down the hall to Helen's private home office. The heavy oak door was unlocked, and her mahogany filing cabinets were waiting. Helen's private office was exactly like her, remarkably cold, highly organized, and overwhelmingly expensive. I set Lily's infant carrier gently on the vintage leather sofa and went straight to the large mahogany filing cabinets positioned in the corner. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for, but Helen was meticulously anal retentive. She kept detailed paper trails for absolutely everything. If she had a pediatric file from 30 years ago, it would be perfectly categorized. I pulled open the heavy drawer labeled Family Medical. It was tightly stuffed with thick manila folders. I quickly flipped through the stiff paper tabs until I found one clearly labeled Mark, Pediatric. My hands were actually shaking as I opened it on the desk. Inside, I found the exact yellow document she had waved like a trophy at the baptism. It was a hospital discharge summary from when Mark had a routine tonsillectomy at age 6. I rapidly scanned the page. There, highlighted in faded yellow marker, was his listed blood type, a negative. I stared at it in confusion. It wasn't a cheap forgery. It looked completely authentic. But I fundamentally knew it was wrong. Mark donated blood frequently in college. The Red Cross wouldn't make a mistake about his type. Why did his childhood hospital record explicitly say A negative? I started digging deeper into the drawer, looking for Arthur's personal files to see if there was a family history of bizarre clerical errors. I found a thick folder labeled Arthur, Military and Medical. Arthur had served briefly in the reserves before taking over his family's lucrative real estate business. I opened the folder, carefully pulling out a stack of pristine, preserved documents. Near the very bottom of the pile, I found a heavy cardstock document. It was a certified copy of Arthur's official military medical screening from the late 1980s. I ran my finger down the lines of typed text until I hit his blood type. I stopped. I read it again. Then I read it a third time, feeling a strange, freezing sensation wash over the back of my neck. It wasn't a typo. The military is incredibly precise about blood typing for combat readiness. The letters printed on the official Department of Defense form were undeniable. Arthur's blood type was explicitly listed as AB positive. I stood perfectly still in the dead quiet of the office. Any high school biology student knows an AB parent cannot have an O child. I quickly grabbed a pen and a piece of Helen's ridiculously expensive monogrammed stationery from her desk. I needed to see it written down on paper to make sure I wasn't entirely losing my mind. I hastily drew a simple Punnett square. Arthur is AB. That fundamentally means he carries an A allele and AB allele. When he biologically fathers a child, he must pass on either the A or the B. It is a biological absolute. Therefore, Arthur's biological child can potentially have an A, B, or AB blood type. Mark is O negative. To be type O, a person must strictly inherit an O allele from both parents. An O child cannot possibly come from an AB parent under any normal circumstances. It completely defies the fundamental laws of human genetics. Mark's existence as an O-negative man made his biological connection to Arthur completely impossible. Suddenly, the entire toxic history of our family snapped into incredibly sharp, horrifying focus. Helen's intense paranoia, her aggressive obsession with pedigree and unyielding loyalty, her frantic need to convince Mark he was A-negative, going so far as to highlight a clearly erroneous childhood hospital record and proudly wave it in my face. Helen hadn't made a mistake. She knew. She had definitively known for 30 years. She had an affair, got pregnant with another man's child, and seamlessly passed him off as the sole heir to Arthur's massive fortune. When my daughter was born with O-negative blood, a glaring, undeniable genetic marker, Helen utterly panicked. She was terrified someone would notice the glaring discrepancy. To protect her own devastating secret, she deliberately decided to burn my life to the ground. She aggressively projected her own infidelity onto me, using the very thing she was hiding as the weapon to destroy my marriage. I felt physically sick to my stomach. I looked at my sleeping daughter. Helen was perfectly willing to leave a newborn baby fatherless just to cover her own selfish tracks. She thought she was so incredibly smart. She thought she had me perfectly trapped. But in her blind arrogance, she had aggressively demanded a comprehensive genetic lineage panel to fully humiliate me. She voluntarily put Arthur's DNA into the exact same testing pool as Mark's. I carefully placed the military record back into the file, perfectly aligning the edges. I closed the cabinet drawer, suddenly holding the power to destroy her entire life. When I finally got back home, I immediately booted up my laptop. I didn't want to rely solely on my rudimentary memory of high school biology. I spent 3 solid hours intensely reading medical journals, genetic counseling websites, and professional hematology forums. I searched for every possible rare genetic mutation, chimerism, the Bombay phenotype, extreme chromosomal anomalies. I desperately needed to know if there was even a fractional percentage of a chance that Arthur could biologically father Mark. The clinical answer was universally, definitively no. The science was absolute. Mark was not Arthur's biological son. I sat alone in the dark living room, the pale glow of the screen illuminating my face. The sheer, breathtaking scale of Helen's hypocrisy was staggering. For years, she had looked directly down her nose at me. She treated me like absolute trash simply because I didn't come from a wealthy, established family. She constantly preached about the paramount importance of the family bloodline, about aggressively protecting Arthur's legacy from manipulative gold diggers. And all the while, she was the ultimate fraud. She was the one who had fundamentally betrayed Arthur. Mark finally came downstairs around midnight. He saw me sitting in the dark and paused hesitantly at the bottom of the stairs. He looked incredibly exhausted, completely defeated by the crushing tension in our house. "Sarah, please," he said quietly. "Can we just talk? I know my mom went way too far, but once the test comes back and clears you, things will go back to normal. We can strictly set boundaries." I stared at him in the dark. He looked so remarkably much like Arthur in his specific mannerisms, in the exact way he stood and the gentle way he spoke. 30 years of closely mirroring a man he truly thought was his father. My heart physically ached for him. He had absolutely no idea that his entire existence was built on a massive, unforgivable lie. "Things are never going back to normal, Mark," I whispered. I couldn't tell him. Not yet. Not until I had the concrete proof from the independent lab in my hands. If I told him now, he simply wouldn't believe me. He would tell Helen, and she would find a way to spin it. She would eagerly destroy the evidence. I had to let her spring her own trap. The notification on my phone screen abruptly shattered the silence of the dark room. The sudden text message was from the testing lab. It wasn't the final results, but an automated status update. The genetic samples were fully processed, and the final comprehensive report would be generated within 48 hours. The clock was rapidly running out. The very next morning, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Helen aggressively standing on my front porch, dressed in an immaculate, incredibly expensive designer suit, looking exactly like she was arriving for a hostile corporate takeover. She didn't wait for an invitation. She confidently brushed past me into the foyer, her suffocating perfume instantly filling the space. "I received the lab notification this morning," she said, sharply turning to face me. "I wanted to give you one final opportunity to salvage some minor shred of dignity. If you confess right now, before the results are published, I will personally convince Mark to handle the divorce quietly. You can walk away without a massive public spectacle. If you force us to read those results, I will make absolutely sure my attorneys drain every single cent you have. You won't even get joint custody." I stood there, silently looking at this monstrous woman. I felt an overwhelming, almost physical urge to scream the absolute truth right in her face, to loudly tell her I knew exactly what she did in the 80s. The heavy burden of this knowledge was agonizing. If I exposed her, I would be entirely vindicated. My name would be cleared forever, but the collateral damage would be completely apocalyptic. Arthur, who had only ever been incredibly kind to me, would have his heart brutally ripped out. Mark's entire reality would shatter into pieces. I could save them both. I could agree to walk away, quietly take Lily, and disappear. But that fundamentally meant letting Helen win. That meant my innocent daughter growing up thinking her father abandoned her because her mother was a proven liar. I absolutely couldn't do that. I wouldn't sacrifice my daughter's truth to protect Helen's lies. "You're very confident, Helen," I said, intentionally keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "But you really shouldn't have ordered that extended ancestry panel." For a fraction of a second, her polished mask slipped. A tiny flicker of confusion, perhaps a ghost of pure panic, flashed across her eyes. But her massive ego immediately buried it. She loudly sneered at me. "I want Arthur to see exactly what you are," she spat. She walked out the door, completely unaware that she had just ordered her own execution. The next 48 hours were a literal waking nightmare. I hardly slept at all. I kept looking at Mark as he quietly ate breakfast, completely oblivious to the Category 5 hurricane rapidly bearing down on his life. I intensely wrestled with the morality of what was about to happen. Was I fundamentally doing the right thing by letting the genetic test move forward? Was I actually just as vindictive as Helen if I allowed Arthur to be completely humiliated in a room full of people? I decided I had to try one last time to actively minimize the blast radius. Not for Helen, but for Arthur and Mark. I called Helen's cell phone on Tuesday afternoon. She quickly answered on the second ring, sounding fiercely triumphant. "Have you finally called your lawyers, Sarah?" "Cancel the test, Helen," I said, my voice trembling slightly from the sheer, crushing weight of what I was holding back. "I am genuinely begging you. Cancel the genetic panel. If you want a basic paternity test, fine. But strictly cancel the extended lineage panel. Call the lab right now and tell them to completely shred Arthur's sample. You do not want those specific results made public." "Terrified of the absolute truth, Sarah," she mocked, her voice heavily dripping with pure venom. "No," I replied firmly. "I am terrified for Arthur. I am actively trying to protect this family. If you open that sealed envelope on Thursday, everything you have ever built will be permanently destroyed. This is your absolute last chance." There was a brief, tense pause on the line. I desperately prayed she was smart enough to hear the genuine warning in my voice. I prayed she would connect the obvious dots and realize I knew her secret. Instead, she laughed. It was a cold, incredibly cruel sound. "You are completely pathetic. You actually think you can bluff your way out of a genetic certainty? The formal family meeting is scheduled for Thursday evening at my house. Be there, or we will legally assume you have abandoned the marriage." She hung up on me. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. I had sincerely tried. I genuinely tried to give her an exit ramp. But her absolute arrogance had completely blinded her to her own glaring vulnerability. She was so obsessed with destroying me that she completely refused to look down at the trap directly beneath her own feet. The chime of a new email arriving in my inbox made my breath catch sharply. The ominous subject line of the email read, "Confidential laboratory results, secure portal link." I stared intensely at the bright screen for a very long time. My heart was pounding so hard I could actually hear it in my ears. I didn't click the link. I didn't need to read it. I already knew exactly what the genetic data would show. Mark finally came home from work an hour later. He looked physically exhausted, his broad shoulders heavily slumped as he walked slowly through the front door. "My mom called," he said quietly, carefully avoiding eye contact. "She got the exact same email notification. She personally printed the final results at her office. She wants us over there precisely at 7 o'clock. Arthur is flying back early from Chicago just to be there." He finally looked up at me, his eyes wide and desperately pleading. "Sarah, please, whatever is actually in that envelope, if there's something you need to honestly tell me, just say it right now. Let's not do this in front of them." "I have absolutely nothing to confess to you, Mark," I said evenly, holding his gaze. "But you desperately need to prepare yourself. Tonight is going to change absolutely everything." I packed Lily's small diaper bag with slow, incredibly deliberate precision. I carefully dressed her in a soft pink sweater. I felt an eerie, unnatural sense of calm wash entirely over me. The crushing anxiety of the past 2 weeks completely evaporated, cleanly replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. The waiting was finally over. The absolute truth was already printed firmly on a piece of paper sitting on Helen's expensive dining room table. We drove to the massive estate in total, suffocating silence. The heavy iron gates swung open, and we slowly pulled up the incredibly long driveway. Arthur's luxury sedan was already parked near the grand entrance. The house was brightly lit up like a fortress. When we walked through the heavy front doors, the absolute silence in the grand foyer was suffocating. Arthur stood quietly near the fireplace, looking deeply uncomfortable. Helen sat rigidly at the head of the massive dining table. Placed perfectly in the exact center of the polished wood was an incredibly thick, sealed white envelope bearing the clinic's official crest. I walked completely into the room, holding Lily close to my chest, and stood directly across from my mother-in-law. Helen placed her hand flat on top of the envelope and offered a wicked smile. "Well," Helen confidently began, her sharp voice echoing loudly in the cavernous dining room. "I'm genuinely surprised you actually showed up, Sarah. I honestly assumed you would have completely fled the state by now. Helen, please, Arthur interjected, heavily rubbing his temples. Let's just open the damn document, verify the necessary information, and put this incredibly ugly chapter completely behind us. This never should have escalated to this extreme point. It escalated purely because she lied, Arthur, Helen snapped, absolutely never taking her intensely judgmental eyes off me. She arrogantly tried to dilute our family's legacy. But science is absolute. It completely strips away all the deceit. Mark stood directly next to me, visibly shaking. Mom, just open it. Please stop dragging this out. Helen slowly picked up a heavy silver letter opener. She slid it completely under the flap of the thick envelope with absolutely agonizing slowness. She confidently pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. I closely watched her eyes dart quickly across the dense medical terminology on the very first page. She was eagerly looking for the summary paragraph, the simple, conclusive sentence that would entirely vindicate her cruelty. She eagerly flipped to the second page, then the third. Suddenly, Helen completely stopped moving. The incredibly smug, deeply triumphant sneer on her face completely vanished. Absolutely all the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a terrifying, ashen gray. Her mouth parted slightly, but absolutely no sound came out. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the incredibly thick stack of papers audibly rattled against each other. What is it, Helen? Arthur asked, stepping much closer to the table. What does it actually say? Helen didn't answer him. She slowly looked up from the paper, her eyes incredibly wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. She stared directly at me. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I just firmly held my daughter and watched the exact moment her 30-year facade completely collapsed into dust. Helen, Mark asked, stepping forward nervously. What's wrong? She frantically tried to fold the thick papers back together. The lab made a massive error, she stammered, her voice incredibly high and breathless. These results are corrupted. The samples were obviously contaminated. I'll completely destroy these, and we will immediately schedule another. Before she could shove the papers back into the envelope, Mark forcefully reached across the table and snatched them out of her trembling hands. He flipped directly to the bolded summary section on the final page and began reading. Mark stared intensely at the paper, his brow deeply furrowing as his brain actively processed the dense clinical text. The room was so incredibly quiet I could clearly hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Probability of paternity regarding Mark and Lily. 99%, Mark read aloud, his voice loudly cracking with immense, overwhelming relief. He quickly looked up at me, tears instantly welling in his eyes. She's mine. Sarah, I'm so incredibly sorry. She's mine. Keep reading, Mark, I said, my voice confidently cutting through the massive room like ice. Read the results of the extended genetic panel your mother specifically demanded. Helen violently lunged forward, desperately grabbing at Mark's arm. No, Mark, stop. Give that directly to me. It's a terrible mistake. Arthur quickly stepped in, firmly grabbing Helen's wrist and forcefully pulling her back. Let the boy read, Helen. Mark flipped to the very next page. He started slowly reading the data from the incredibly comprehensive comparative ancestry and lineage panel. Probability of genetic relationship between Arthur and Lily. 0.00%. Probability of biological relationship between Arthur and Mark. 0.00%. Mark entirely froze. He completely stopped breathing. He intensely read the horrifying sentence again in absolute silence, his eyes darting frantically across the page as if desperately trying to rearrange the letters into something that made logical sense. Wait, Mark whispered, his voice violently trembling. This says Arthur shares absolutely zero genetic markers with me. It says Arthur isn't my biological father. Arthur stood perfectly, unnervingly still. He slowly turned his head to closely look at his wife of 32 years. Helen was entirely backed against the edge of the dining table, desperately gasping for air, tears heavily streaming down her face, trapped exactly like an animal. You fiercely demanded this test, Helen, I said quietly, addressing her directly for the very first time. You were so obsessively terrified by the fact that Mark couldn't father an O-negative baby. You completely forgot that an AB-positive man like Arthur couldn't father an O-negative child either. I absolutely didn't cheat. I am completely faithful to my husband. You aggressively projected your own disgusting, decades-old lies entirely onto me. Arthur didn't yell. He didn't scream. The absolute, soul-crushing devastation on his face was far more terrifying than anger. He gently placed his hand on Mark's shoulder, looked at Helen, and whispered 2 words. "Who is he?" Arthur's voice was barely a horrifying rasp, entirely devoid of all the warmth and commanding authority I had known for years. Helen completely collapsed into one of the heavy dining chairs, frantically burying her face in her hands, sobbing absolutely uncontrollably. "It was only one time, Arthur. I swear to God. It was a terrible mistake 30 years ago. I didn't fundamentally know for sure. I absolutely couldn't lose you. I was desperately trying to protect our family. You aggressively tried to destroy Sarah strictly to protect yourself," Arthur replied, his voice rapidly hardening into something incredibly sharp and absolute. "You were perfectly willing to permanently label your own grandchild a bastard. You were entirely willing to let my son throw away a fiercely loyal wife and his newborn baby, just to incredibly ensure your disgusting secret stayed completely buried. That isn't protection, Helen. That is pure, unadulterated sociopathic malice." Mark heavily dropped the papers directly on the table. He looked exactly like a man who had just violently survived a horrific car crash. His entire identity, his legacy, his physical resemblance to the man he truly thought was his father. It was all a massive psychological illusion built by an incredibly manipulative woman. He stumbled backward, desperately struggling to breathe, staring closely at his mother exactly as if she were a complete stranger. "Mark." Helen desperately reached out toward him, her expensive mascara running heavily down her cheeks. "You are absolutely still his son in every way that truly matters. Please." Mark permanently turned his back on her. He walked directly over to me, tightly wrapped his arms around me and our sleeping baby, and deeply buried his face in my shoulder. He was shaking violently. Arthur slowly walked to the head of the table. He picked up the genetic DNA results, carefully folded them, and seamlessly placed them in his suit pocket. He looked slowly around the immaculate, wealthy dining room, quietly taking in the crystal chandeliers and the incredibly expensive art, all the things Helen had lied and successfully manipulated to keep. "I will absolutely be calling my attorneys first thing in the morning," Arthur said, his tone utterly devoid of emotion. "You strictly have until tomorrow afternoon to pack whatever you can possibly fit into your car." Arthur walked out the front door, leaving Helen screaming his name in the empty foyer. The massive fallout over the exact next month was incredibly catastrophic, but it was highly surgical. Arthur formally filed for divorce almost immediately. Because of an ironclad, deeply punitive infidelity clause seamlessly built into their original prenuptial agreement, a clause Helen herself had incredibly arrogantly insisted upon strictly to protect the family assets. She was legally entitled to almost absolutely nothing. She lost the massive estate. She lost her incredibly important social standing. The vicious country club gossip completely alienated her entirely from the wealthy friends she valued heavily above absolutely everything else. Mark strictly required intense, weekly therapy. The crushing psychological trauma of losing his entire biological identity literally overnight was completely immense. But remarkably, through it absolutely all, Arthur never entirely abandoned him. Arthur made it completely, unyieldingly clear that genetic DNA did absolutely not erase 30 incredible years of fatherhood. Mark was his son. He formally, legally amended his entire trust to absolutely ensure Mark and Lily were his sole beneficiaries, legally cutting Helen entirely out of the massive legacy she had heavily murdered her own character to desperately protect. As for Mark and me, we surprisingly survived. He deeply begged for my forgiveness for ever briefly doubting me, fully acknowledging that his terrible cowardice had almost completely cost him his family. I didn't forgive him immediately. Genuine trust is a highly fragile thing, and he fundamentally had to completely rebuild it brick by brick. But he stepped up. He finally stopped trying to endlessly appease everyone and started violently protecting our home. When Helen inevitably tried to desperately crawl back into our lives, constantly sending deeply manipulative, tear-stained letters heavily begging to briefly see her granddaughter, Mark was the one who firmly intercepted them. He didn't even open the envelopes. He fiercely ran them completely through the paper shredder in our home office. We established absolutely ironclad boundaries. Helen was completely exiled. She was blocked on every phone, strictly banned from our property, and strictly forbidden from ever having contact with Lily. The woman who had been so obsessively terrified of outsiders infiltrating her precious bloodline was now entirely cut off from the only family she had left. One evening, while I was feeding Lily in the nursery, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I listened to a single, pathetic voicemail before permanently deleting her voice from my life. The voicemail was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. Helen spent 3 minutes crying, blaming the lab, blaming Arthur for being unforgiving, and finally, blaming me for forcing her hand. She still couldn't comprehend that her own actions were the sole architect of her destruction. She had weaponized science to destroy a mother, completely forgetting that science does not negotiate with lies. I didn't feel anger when I deleted the message. I just felt a profound, unwavering sense of peace. The storm she brought to our doorstep was finally over. A few days later, we hosted a small, quiet dinner at our house. There were no expensive caterers, no crystal glasses, and no judgmental eyes watching my every move. It was just me, Mark, and Arthur. Arthur looked noticeably older, the immense stress of the legal separation wearing heavily on him. But when he held Lily, the shadows completely vanished from his face. He sat in the old wooden rocking chair in our living room, gently humming the exact same quiet lullaby he used to sing to Mark when he was a baby. Mark stood next to me in the kitchen doorway, watching the two of them. He slipped his arm around my waist, pulling me close and resting his chin on my shoulder. We had walked through absolute hell over the last few months, but we had made it out together, forged into something much stronger than we ever were before. We had learned the hardest possible way that family is not defined by perfectly matching genetic markers or wealthy, untarnished pedigrees. Family is defined by undeniable truth, unwavering loyalty, and the people who stand by you when the lies finally collapse. Helen spent her entire adult life worshiping a bloodline that was entirely a mirage. She arrogantly demanded a biological reckoning, and she received exactly what she asked for. I looked at my beautiful daughter, sleeping safely and soundly in her grandfather's strong arms, completely untouched by the toxic poison that had tried to claim her. I smiled, resting my head firmly against my husband's shoulder, finally able to breathe the clean air of our home. The ultimate truth is that loyalty cannot be manufactured by blood alone.